Please welcome Victor Luckerson and Ashley Jones.
Thank you. I'm gonna hide my pocketbook. Or purse if you're a young person out there. All right, well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Victor. I'm trying to get my microphone perfectly right so y'all can hear me. So as Jim said, we are here to discuss this wonderful book, which is for sale in the back of the room, so please do get a copy before you leave, because Victor will be signing these afterward.
That's right.
So I'm gonna ask you some questions, Victor, and hopefully we can have just a really good conversation about your work and your life. And then I would love for the audience, if y'all have questions, at a certain point, we'll open it up to you all, and I'll moderate those questions. So be thinking of your questions, maybe write them down if you want to. There will be time for that. Okay, so I wanted to start, Victor, by talking about you before we get to the book itself. So there's this school of thought called the New Criticism. I don't know if you've heard about it, but they believe that the author doesn't matter. That's not me. I believe the author matters a lot. So I want to know, how did your life lead you to this work in particular? You told me earlier you're from Montgomery, so this is a totally different space for you. So how did you get led to this work, and what has kept you with that work for so long?
Well, first off, I just want to thank you, Ashley, for being part of this, participating in this. Ashley and I met tonight, actually, but I just thought that everything she's been doing is super dope in Alabama. So I'm so excited to be here with another amazing Alabama author. And thank you Books for hosting the Birmingham Public Library. This is actually my first book and first book tour, and this is the finale of the tour, and so I'm really excited to be spending it with y'all tonight. And so the question of, how did I get here? I mean, the people who were part of that are right here in the audience. My parents are here tonight. My godparents are here tonight. My high school classmates are here. My college classmates, the people at the student newspaper with me are here. And so all these people sort of played a role in me getting to this point. I've been writing. My parents and godparents both know this since I was like 5 years old, tooling around on the typewriter at home. We had an MS-DOS machine at my house. It was that long ago. And I've always been somebody who wrote, and always somebody who felt that even if the act of writing is solitary, what you produce is communal, something that people can really gather around. And I think I've never really had an opportunity to create something where so many people would gather until this moment, so it's really special. How did I actually wind up in Tulsa? I think that's kind of the question. When I was in college, we have a lot of Bama people here, so tell a little Bama story. So I'm from Montgomery, went to the University of Alabama, grew up in Alabama, and I just remember being there and feeling like I was surrounded by a lot of iconography, imagery, history that wasn't for me, but that it sort of felt very ambient, Like you're on the quad at Alabama. When I was there, there'd be buildings named after Confederate generals, Ku Klux Klan members, eugenicists even. And I remember, critiquing that a little bit in the school newspaper and other outlets, but feeling like nothing really changed about it. But I think having that experience of just being submerged in that kind of history kind of made me attuned to hypocrisy, in our physical landscape. And so I think that's something that was just kind of in my head, even the first time I went to Tulsa, I was editor of the school newspaper, like I said, at the University of Alabama. Then I was a technology reporter for several years. We're going to skip that part of the story because it's really boring. But while I was a technology reporter, I actually got an opportunity to go visit Tulsa in 2018 to write a story about Black Wall Street. If you Googled Black Wall Street 5 years ago, not that much came up actually on the internet. It's kind of crazy how big the story has gotten just in the last 5 years. And so I went there. My goal was to kind of tell a story about this place for younger people to really understand what had happened in Greenwood. And I remember the first time I was there, it was actually the 97th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so in my head, I imagined that this community would be very reverent for what had happened because the atrocity is so horrific. But when I went there was a small vigil happening right there in the neighborhood, Greenwood Avenue, and there were about 30 people at this vigil commemorating the fact that people had literally been murdered in this land. But there were hundreds of other people going to a baseball game, actually, in the neighborhood. And so to be there, sort of experiencing the echo of the trauma for the first time, but to realize that no one else was hearing the echo, that didn't really sit well with me. And so, I read this article for the Ringer where I used to work, and then I felt like I should really go deeper than that. And so from that one trip in 2018, I decided to expand the story, develop it into a book. I quit my job actually in 2019. I packed up my life. I was living in Atlanta. I packed up my life in Atlanta. I made a country music playlist and just drove west, a lot of Old Town Road on there, Lil Nas X. It was that era, So, and luckily for me, I knew I wanted to tell a story about Greenwood, but I didn't know exactly how I wanted to tell it. But I was very fortunate to meet people in this one family who've been on Black Wall Street for more than 100 years. I should say, actually, one person in the family is here today. Greg Goodwin, could you stand and be acknowledged? So Greg's, let me get my numbers right. Greg's great-grandfather and grandmother, J.H. and Carly Goodwin, were people from rural Mississippi. And so they experienced all this Jim Crow persecution that so many black folks did in Alabama, Mississippi, all these places. And they decided to travel from there to this black utopia of Oklahoma. It was called the Eden of the West, in fact, in the early 1900s. And so Greg's great-grandparents came to Tulsa, to Greenwood, to this new black mecca in the 1910s. They opened a grocery store right there on Greenwood Avenue. Greg's grandfather, Ed, was a high school senior in 1921, about to go to college, experience all the positive things of a life, of a future, when their entire community was destroyed, burned to the ground, 35 square blocks, up to 300 people destroyed, 300 people killed, more than 1,200 homes destroyed. And what I really thought was fascinating about the Goodwins of all these folks in this community is that, they rebuilt their home, they rebuilt their livelihoods, they helped their neighbors rebuild, and they stayed there on that same block. Like, they're still there. They own a black newspaper in Greenwood on that block. And that is amazing to me, that one black family could hold forth that long. We don't get that often, you know what I mean? And so once I sort of knew that I wanted to capture these stories about physical landscapes and how they're often not for us or even sort of trying to oppress us, and then I found this physical object, this physical thing in the neighborhood, this newsroom that the Goodwin family owns, it really kind of clicked into place what this story could be and how I could tell a narrative that really gave us a through line from early 1900s all the way to the present day.
It's as if you saw my second question, because you led perfectly into it. I was, as I read the book, I was struck by the close and patient eye that you have for the family narrative. Typically, when I read just a piece of research, sometimes it's hard to create that personal piece. So I'm wondering if, and you kind of have started answering this already, was that present in your mind that you needed to keep that human element there the whole time? And how did you do that? In such a large and expansive book, I'm sure you were doing so much varied research. So how did you keep that present as you wrote?
Yeah, I think the human element was vital to me. I think I didn't want, I think about Watchmen sometimes, and Watchmen is actually one of this TV show called Watchmen. Who saw Watchmen in here? I'm just curious. Okay, wow, a lot of y'all saw Watchmen. Oh, yeah. Right, yeah. So Watchmen opens with a depiction of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's like an 8-minute or so depiction. It's very brutal. I think I said I read an article about it once, and I think I said that the massacre had never been depicted with such brutal glamour, as a Hollywood production. And I noticed when I was watching that it was really visceral, but also a little bit anonymized. You saw black people getting shot from the back, sort of getting attacked, you didn't know what their names were. And I just felt very like you're getting the download of the trauma, but not the humanity. And so I knew I didn't want to sort of recreate that sensation with what I wrote. And so that was why it was so important to really dig deep into who these people were, who they were then, who their families are now, you know what I mean? And so, again, it was just a pleasure to meet the Goodwins, and in terms of even how I connected with them, a lot of how I sort of created this narrative, because in the book, you sort of follow their family coming to Tulsa, coming to Greenwood, surviving the race massacre, sort of their lives they lived after that, and sort of the rebuilt Greenwood. They had this really nice farm outside town called Willow Lake Farm, and you sort of get this sort of sense of this sort of like black excellence that they really represented, while still holding it down for the community, so I love that dichotomy. And honestly, a lot of it was just really being patient. Like you said, like the book is patient, but I was also patient. Greg has an aunt named Jean Arredondo who is in Nashville. And Jean has an amazing, I've been to her archive. She has an entire attic full of documents from their family dating back more than 100 years. And Jean Arredondo is not going to let anybody in her attic. You know what I mean? She's not just going to let you stroll up in there. And so the process of connecting with her involved, I actually found research about her grandmother, Carly, who had come to Tulsa from Mississippi. So I was able to find some research about Carly she didn't know. I mailed it to Jean. And I think me being forthcoming with what I was finding helped open her up and trust me, you know what I mean? And so everything I've done, I've tried to make sure that it felt reciprocal with the families that I was working with. I didn't want to be extractive. I think journalism is almost extractive by nature, but I didn't want that to be the takeaway from what I did. And so with somebody like Miss Arredondo, it was about that. We had a set date every Monday during COVID. I would just call her every Monday and say, tell me about your grandfather, tell me about your grandmother, tell me about your brother, And I think just having that time to really get to know people really seeped into me and hopefully seeped into the work.
Yeah, I think I'm going off script, which I don't like to do, but you said something that made me think. Often when we read these kind of journalistic pieces, and my sister's a journalist, so I'm not coming for y'all, like I love journalists, not coming for you at all. But often when it's this kind of investigative thing, sometimes it can come off, especially when it's a Southern story, or I guess Oklahoma's
Controversial subject.
And so it can come off as like someone just coming to look at the circus animals in a way, and oh, how terrible, and oh, how, that kind of thing. And so hearing some of your research methods, which included building a relationship, that feels like, you really are trying to keep your humanness in there as well and not lose sight of the human, the care that is needed for this kind of story. At any point in your research, did you feel like the story was too big? Like, how did you keep it all in one book?
No, it never felt too big to me. I was get excited about new discoveries. I'm telling 2 discovery stories right now. So in the Goodwin family, I discovered that so J.H. and Carly are the ones who came, and then Ed, their son, was a high school senior and survived the race massacre. He comes back to Tulsa after college. He's trying to figure out how he's going to become a businessman in Greenwood. He has a storefront on Greenwood Avenue, but the Great Depression hits, right? So his store is like struggling. He's trying to figure out what he's going to do. And a man approaches him and says, "Hey, Ed, have you ever heard of the numbers?" The numbers is anybody played the numbers or know about the numbers in the audience? I know, my godparents know about the numbers. Okay, all right. But the numbers is essentially like the lottery today. You would have folks picking 3 to 5 numbers per day. If your numbers hit, you get a little payout. But it was illegal in the 1930s, and you could be jailed, fined, etc. for participating. And Ed Goodwin was sort of a leader of the numbers, actually. He led the numbers racket in Tulsa. He also was involved in bootlegging and these kind of activities. And I remember reading this stuff and being kind of surprised how deep he was in the game. And I was like, wow, that's kind of crazy, because this family has kind of like this sort of civil rights sort of persona. Like, this is really kind of surprising to me. And so I told my mom about it. I would tell my mom about some of my research as I was doing it. And I told her, like, Mom, I can't believe I'm finding out about this guy that I've been researching. And then my mom was like, oh, your granddaddy did the same things back in the day. And so that really opened my eyes to the fact that black folks don't have like a direct route to the middle class, especially back then. There was no ladder, there was no red carpet. And so that route is actually common. I told that we have a book club that I got to participate in here tonight, and I told them that story on Skype, or we had the Zoom call where I explained that story to them, and they were like, oh yeah, that sounds right, that sounds familiar, you know what I mean, that route to black success, especially in that era. And so that was sort of a discovery I made, so that my point is that expanded the scope of the book. When I found that I wanted to capture that story about what he did, I also wanted to capture that whole economy, right? This whole sort of like quote-unquote underground economy that kept Greenwood going in the 1930s. Another fun discovery I made was, so fast forward, it's 1950s Greenwood, and I'm a huge music guy. Everybody here who knows me knows I'm really into music. And I had to figure out, how do I fit music into this book? And like, my editor was kind of like, you can't just make a music chapter. Like, she kind of like, she thought it'd be off topic, so I'm gonna prove you wrong. I'm gonna figure out a way to do this. And so I'm reading through the Oklahoma Eagle, the black newspaper in the community, and I find this guy named Louis Overby, who was a reporter for the Eagle. Louis Overby had a nightlife column every single week in the Eagle, and he was like living my fantasy life basically. He was going into the bars and the nightclubs every single weekend. He was meeting like Bo Diddley and Etta James, B.B. King. All these folks came through Tulsa, came through Greenwood at this facility called the Big Ten Ballroom. And it was really fascinating because they were coming right around the time Brown v. Board passed. So they were coming right when the color line was starting to disintegrate in America. So you hear like this guy interviewed B.B. King, and B.B. King is talking about how, oh, I really don't want to still like perform for black audiences. And Etta James is talking about in Tulsa, oh, this white artist performed my song too, and they're getting all the credit, they're getting all the record sales, you know. So it was really interesting being able to capture integration from a pop culture perspective or music perspective. And that was something that wasn't in my original outline for the book, but when I discovered this Louis Overby guy, I was like, he's got to be in the book. He was 30, I was 30. I was like, this guy's like, I'm channeling this guy, you know what I mean? So I had to put his story in there. And so for me, I felt that those things were important to capture because they give a more authentic view of what Greenwood is. This book cannot just be one trauma to the next, you know what I mean? Traveling almost like you're doing a paint by numbers of trauma. I didn't want to do that. And so for me, having those moments about, oh, this is what the gambling was like, oh, this is what the nightlife was like, oh, this is how you snuck liquor into the bar when it was still illegal. All that's like real stuff, you know what I mean? And so it's so important to me to make that as prominent in the book as the traumas that we have to sort of march through as well.
Right, I think that is so important. As Black people in America, we are wading through a lot of trauma in past, present, and probably future. But as writers, it is important for us to not only care for our audience by showing them the whole picture, but also ourselves. So I want to ask you something that people have asked me, because I was going to ask you about what surprised you, but you already answered my question because you're in my mind somehow. But I'm often asked whenever I do any book events, how do I care for myself in this work, which can be very taxing emotionally on me, the writer. So with this topic, I'm sure the same is true, to have to learn and relearn and discover the lives of these people who experience such a horrible, horrible trauma. How did you care for yourself during the process? Or did you even, stop all the furious researching to do that self-care?
That's really important, and I think it is something that, I was actually reading your book, Reparations Now, earlier today, actually, and I was reading through some of the horrific lynchings that you sort of, and her book actually sets up these horrific lynchings, then kind of ruminates on them in various poems. And I was like, it cut me, to read those stories. So I thought about that. I know something that, as Black writers and people who are both want to mind that history, but also, at least I sometimes feel like, am I obligated to do this? Like, is this my duty in life? And should I take on that duty? I mean, I would imagine you sort of dealt with that, the challenge of that thought too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think about, I quote this person all the time. This is my favorite poet, Lucille Clifton. So those of you who know me, sorry. But she has this poem called Surely I Am Able to Write Poems. And the poem starts by saying, I can see the beautiful sky, the beautiful Chesapeake. But when I start to write the poem about the beautiful tree, there's always under that poem another poem. And I think maybe it's less for me that I feel obligated, but that I just can't help but see, And I think for those of us who are marginalized, we can't help but see maybe more than other people. It's harder for me to ignore these things. But you're in the middle of your answer.
Oh yeah, no, I love that though. That's why I was a tech reporter and we skipped that part of the story because I couldn't help but get back into this. It's exactly the same thing. I really did a very poor job, I think, of caring for myself, to be very honest with you. I actually think a lot about how the tornado in 2011 that went through Tuscaloosa, and a lot of people here experienced that as well. And I remember in that experience, when I was the editor of the school newspaper, and in that experience, I just remember being so laser focused on work, reporting, gathering the facts, telling them, figuring out what was going on, and just like not even really trying to process that we had our classmates killed and our neighbor destroyed and all these kind of things, and so many other people in that community who suffered so much. And I remember in that case, I didn't process. I remember a year later, I just started sobbing in my apartment one day, reflecting on it. So that was a scenario in which I experienced a traumatic event and just kind of let it bottle up and come out. Unfortunately, I repeated the same thing with the coverage of this. Unfortunately, I learned a few lessons, but I just think that, well, I guess one thing I did that I think was actually positive was, so I had to write the chapters about the race massacre itself. There's 3 chapters in the book about the race massacre that go into extreme detail about how things unfolded on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. And to write those chapters, I actually went to this place in Greenwood called Standpipe Hill. There's a hill in Greenwood where during the race massacre, a machine gun was set and used to fire down into the neighborhood at black residents. And I actually went up there. You can see the whole neighborhood there. And by then, I knew enough to be able to imagine where the Goins had lived and where A.J. Smith, another prominent figure, had lived, and where the business district was, and all these things. And so I sat up there and I wrote it out by hand. And I never write by hand, not since I was a little kid, dreaming of being a writer one day. And I think that writing it out by hand allowed me to take it slower and really kind of feel what I was trying to communicate in a deeper way. And so that wasn't thought of as self-care. I didn't think of it that way. I was thinking about how to access a deeper creative well. But I do think that doing it that way helped me process it in real time in some ways. And the only thing I'll bring up on this point is that, so there's a scene in the book about the 50th anniversary of the race massacre at a Mount Zion Baptist Church. Is this church that was burned down during the race massacre. Y'all might have seen images and documentaries of a huge church with literally smoke billowing out of the belfry. That's Mount Zion. And so on the 50th anniversary of the race massacre, they actually had a ceremony there to commemorate it. And so that's really powerful to me. It's because in the 1970s in Tulsa, if you mentioned the race riot, you could still be threatened at that time. But the black folks, Greg's grandfather Ed was one of the keynote speakers. They said this is important. It's important for our children to know this happened. So I got an audio recording of the event, and it was really exciting because I got to hear what Ed Goodwin sounded like and other figures in the book. It was a great journalistic find. That's why I was I got the goods, But they also, during this ceremony, the choir at the church sang, "Lift every voice and sing." And I don't know, I think it was me being in 2021, hearing this choir in 1971 discussing 1921. Whenever I think about black people and our connections to the past and the way we're all bound in this history that we don't even know enough about, it makes me extremely emotional. And so that was another time when the emotion of it all came out, when I really sort of just thought about my place in this world, trying to capture these folk stories and sort of realizing all the trauma they had been processing when they were singing that song. And that was, being transferred to me in some ways in that moment. And so that was another moment in which the emotion overwhelmed me. So I have not done a great job of doing regular self-care, but I have had moments, I think, where I've almost been forced to reckon with what I'm excavating.
Yeah, that sounds like an incredibly powerful moment. And often the research will take you to a place you didn't really want to go, emotionally.
For sure.
So I guess now you'll have a little time away, maybe. You're finishing this leg of your book tour. I'm sure there's something ahead that will force you right back in to the fold. Yeah. But maybe you'll have some time to just meditate.
Oh yeah, I'm going to the beach next month.
There you go. So you mentioned the idea of people not wanting to talk about, or not wanting us to talk about this history. And of course, we all know what time we're living in, which is maybe the time we've always been living in, but y'all know. But now we're having people, write laws to say that we can't, say certain things or teach certain things in schools. And I have experienced a little bit of, people being a little scared of what I'm going to say on the road. And so I'm curious, in your travels and even in your research, did you come up against some of these people who really were stop researching this, stop writing it, why are you here, especially as an outsider too? Mm-hmm. Did anyone, sort of find issue with you telling this story?
I think that actually, instead of people sort of explicitly being, don't tell the story, it's kind of more don't tell it that way.
Okay.
It's more kind of because I think these days in some circles, there is obviously a backlash to telling Black history, mm-hmm. but there's also kind of this economic engine that's been created to profit off of Black history. Mm-hmm. And so I dealt more with the people in that sphere, I think. So for example, my book actually digs into modern Tulsa. There's a whole section about modern Tulsa in this book, and it talks about how a big new museum has been built in Greenwood that's in my opinion, reflects some level of hollow symbolism. Like this museum was built gathering millions of dollars, but none of those dollars were actually given to race massacre survivors or descendants, just as an example. And I talk a little bit about like nonprofits, which kind of control a lot of our society now, but not really discussed that much because they have really positive missions. And so those are the kind of people who are like, I'm not the bad guy, why are you putting me in this? And they tell me that, you know what I mean? But I think it's important that people sort of see the whole picture. And I think the modern part of the book tries to say, this is the whole picture. It's not just, like I do have some stuff in the book about we go to the Capitol, we meet the conservatives in the Capitol, we see what they're up to. But there are other people who are sort of ostensibly sort of for us. That's what they say, you know what I mean? And I sometimes disagree with that, or I think we should at least get a more holistic view of what they're up to. And so for me, it's been more of those types of folks who have been pushing back or saying that I'm not telling the story the right way. Like those folks would love for this book to have ended after the race massacre, you know? Because then we can say those people are gone they've been gone for 100 years. They might be bad, but we don't have to do anything about it because they're gone. And so I think when I bring it to the present day, that's when things get spicy. And so that's sort of what's been more of a pushback, I think, for me.
Yeah, so that really segues perfectly. I'm really starting to be afraid because I feel like, I don't know if you can see them or what it is, but we're right on track with my line of thought. So I don't know why or how I forgot that Terrence Crutcher was murdered in Tulsa. Like it didn't even occur to me. And maybe it's because there's so many to keep up with, unfortunately. It's hard to even know where on the map this happens because it happens in every place. But the sections on Terrence Crutcher and his family were really very interesting to me. And the link that you draw, which you don't even have to draw it, it's there already, but the link between how police behaved during the massacre and what's happening now, or forever it seems, with relations between Black people and police was very just eye-opening, even for somebody whose eyes were already opened, you know what I mean? Right. So I wondered if you might talk a little bit about understanding that connection, how important it is for all of us to get that connection right, not just with Tulsa, but with every place that has kind of always had these issues. And what might our deepened knowledge of the Tulsa story add to our fight for justice?
Yeah, so there is, in the modern section of the book, I go into a lot of depth. Like in a lot of sections of the book, I kind of take a different policy issue or act of racism, whether it's violent, policy-driven, or in some ways personal. I think this issue of, you have a really, I think in your poetry book, you talk a lot about this fear that the police have, that they just get to execute, and then we're the ones who get killed. And so there's something kind of personal, I think, also in this dynamics with police and Black people. But the reason that took so much prominence in my book is because that was the issue of the day. That was very much a journalistic decision for me. I said, I'm gonna go to Tulsa, and I'm gonna see what people there care about right now. And this is before George Floyd was murdered, but they were calling Terrence Crutcher's name. They were saying justice for Terrence Crutcher. And even the first time I went there I went on that first reporting trip where the vigil happened and the baseball game happened. During that trip, I met Terrence's twin sister, Tiffany. And she was the one who first said, what happened to my brother is the same thing that happened in 1921. That's a quote that she said that I think is in the book. And so she was the one who sort of like created that frame for me in a lot of ways. And so for me, I felt the modern part of the book is the most journalistic, where I said, let me take a step back and just say what these folks who are fighting in Greenwood are advocating for. And so that's why I thought it was important to talk about police violence at length. Little did I know that all that was planned and reported and done before George Floyd was murdered. So I had no way of knowing that this issue of police violence, obviously it was prominent before then, but it had not subsumed the United States the way it did in 2020. And I'm really glad that, I was in Tulsa when, like in many communities, protesters shut down a highway the weekend after George Floyd was murdered. And I was in sort of these negotiations going on between the city and the activists. And I saw how the city promised certain things then, but then kind of reneged after sort of the cameras left. And so now I'm really glad I have all that in the book, because I think some people kind of want to pretend like 2020 was like a dream or something, like it didn't even happen, And so I think having that chronicled and putting it in a lineage with 1921, the Civil Rights Movement, all these things are in the book, but having that lineage all put together I think is really important. And so that's sort of how the police violence issue took on such a large role in the story. And then I love what you said about the connections, because what I liked about the book too, what I liked about the book too is some things are, like you said, they're not stated. You know, I don't think I ever have I don't have a page that's like, and this is why this is like 1921. It's just like you would see that if you have your eyes open. And I think that is good because it respects the reader's intelligence. As for the new pathways towards justice, one thing I'm really excited about, actually my high school classmate Jake is here, and we're working together on this project in Montgomery where we're going to have a book club where people read the book but think about how what's going on in this book reflects their community, you know? So how does the racial violence depicted in the book in Tulsa reflect what happened in Montgomery and Jim Crow? How does Tulsa experience being redlined reflect how Montgomery was redlined? How does the civil rights movement in Tulsa differ or similar, highway construction in Tulsa, et cetera? And then also today, Montgomery is a huge civil rights, Black history tourism center. Maybe the biggest in America now, which is really crazy being from there because it wasn't like that when I was a kid. So, you know, what are the politics of that? Who's benefiting from that? I think this book kind of changes the lens in some ways. I think it opens up people in other communities to really explore that. So I'm really excited about that thing we're doing. The book club just started this month, so I'm excited about that. And I would love to have that model apply to Birmingham or lots of other communities around the country.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a great model for, I was going to say regular people, but I mean non-students, you know, but also students. Are you focusing on particular groups with that book club or just anybody?
No, I think it's like, it was kind of like a whoever wants to be part of it. And then we were excited because like 24 people agreed to do it. Y'all are just ready to read this big old book? Wow. Over the summer? So we were very excited about that. And so that's really exciting, I think, because it shows that, and I think we know this, people want to understand why their cities are the way they are. Why the communities are the way they are. Everyone wants to know that. You know, if something's wrong with your community, you want to be able to dig to the bedrock of why that is. But I think you have to find ways to let that be accessible to people. The powers that be very purposely make it hard to understand, you know what I mean? So anything that can decode those dynamics is extremely valuable.
So I'm going to do 2 more questions so we have time for the audience to ask you some questions. This book talks some about reparations, especially in the end, you know, the modern Tulsa sections. And there are some things that are, you know, explained about what they've tried to do, what they've tried to achieve. Can you talk a little bit about those efforts? And also if you have any personal feelings on what you think reparations could look like or should look like across America?
So in terms of reparations in Tulsa, it's really been a 102-year-long fight. You know, there were lawsuits filed. I have this story. I learned this story in the book about Lula Williams. She owned the Dreamland Theater, which was depicted in Watchmen. The Dreamland Theater was burned down during the race massacre. Lula and her son Willie were actually separated for a couple of days, and I kind of walked through their journey in the book. And, you know, they get reunited in this really dramatic moment, and then what Willie, her son, said was, her first stop was the attorney's office. That was the first thing she was gonna do. I'm gonna get what I deserve for what just happened to me. Lula's family has never received one dime for having the Dreamland Theater and her other properties destroyed. So at that time they filed lawsuits. This was to follow her family. Lula's family filed a lawsuit right after the race massacre. Justice was not served. In the 1990s, a large group of race massacre survivors, including Lula's daughter, Ed Goodwin's wife, Jean, also filed in this lawsuit. Hundreds of other people filed a lawsuit, again, seeking reparations. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, but what's really ironic about that situation is that the Supreme Court dismissed the case because they said the statute of limitations had expired. So because in 1921, the racist justice system said, threw the case out, in 2001, the court said, well, you already tried, so you can't try again. That's the way, sorry, those are the rules. And so these days, now there's a new novel restitution case going through the courts, essentially arguing that the city of Tulsa created a public nuisance in Greenwood during the race massacre. It's kind of a roundabout way of getting to the justice, but they have good precedent on their side. In Oklahoma, actually, Johnson & Johnson was, I guess found guilty is not the right word, but Johnson & Johnson was found to have created a public nuisance in Oklahoma because of marketing opioids. So Johnson & Johnson created a public nuisance by helping to enrage the opioid crisis through their deceptive marketing. And so they tried to use, the lawyers in Tulsa for Greenwood are trying to use the same argument and say that the city of Tulsa created a public nuisance in 1921 that persists to today. So that's been a very interesting case to follow. I was actually in the courtroom last month, and the oldest living survivor of the race massacre, Viola Fletcher, It was actually her 109th birthday. And she was in the courtroom too. And so that's, again, that cuts, you know?
Yeah.
Somebody on their 109th birthday who survived that, having to go to the courtroom again because it's been 102 years and no one's done anything. So that case is still kind of kicking around through the courts. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. So those are kind of the three, on the legal reparations side, that's like the three things that have been going on historically. In terms of sort of where I sit on it, I think it's really important. Well, I guess I say this. I think there's kind of like two tracks of reparations that I see. There's a moral argument, and then there's sort of like the legal argument. And so I think you have to have both simultaneously, right? You know what I mean? I think you have to have that moral argument that like stirs your soul and your sense of humanity and your sense of what's right. You know what I mean? I feel like when I read reparations now, I get that. I understand like this is a moral wrong that was done to our people, and this country cannot be what it claims to be without doing right by it. You know what I mean? I feel like simultaneously you have to have a legal argument, right? You're not going to get the reparations without using the tools of the master. It's just not going to happen. And so, to me, Tulsa is a great test case, right? Because it's all there. We have the documentation. We have all these folks like the Goodwins and the Williams who filed these lawsuits 100 years ago. We have testimony from the police of the time literally saying, yes, we deputized men to invade Greenwood. We didn't know their names. Saying like, yes, some of those men applied the torch. These are quotes from like actual like court case records that I've found. And so we have all this evidence of what happened. And so I think Tulsa is a really good model because if you can't prove it in Tulsa, then the whole sort of system is bogus. You know what I mean? And so that's why I think it's a really important place for people to keep their eye on and to keep sort of pursuing this level of justice because the massacre was so horrific, but the evidence is so copious that if we can't atone for that, there's something sort of rotten about the American project, to be honest with you.
I have my thoughts about that. When you were talking about, we have to use the tools of the master, I'm quoting you badly, so you're here, so you can correct me in real time. But it made me think, of course, of Audre Lorde and her famous essay about not using the master's tools, that they cannot be the thing that breaks the system. So there's maybe a third arm, the like, break this glass in emergency arm, which is maybe the system is never going to work the way that we want to because it wasn't set up for us anyway. But I don't know where we go really from there. I mean, like you said, if reparations can't happen in a place like Tulsa where we can document it all, because in other places, sometimes it's harder to document. All of us, all across America, have had some sort of burning, even if it wasn't literally burning down our buildings. We are all sort of, a part of these American traumas. And I hope that Tulsa can be the place where it begins. But the same could even be said for Birmingham or Montgomery. If we can't atone for wrongs here, and yes, we have all these amazing, museums and, the walking trail, all these acknowledgements. But of course, that history is still kind of alive in the good and bad ways here. So I hope, I don't have any answer to what I'm asking you or to what I'm saying at all, but I do hope that Tulsa or other places where, this history is so palpable and like we can touch it, I hope that that's where some of these reparations can begin so that we won't have to go another 100 and however many years still fighting these same battles. I don't know that I'm extremely optimistic right now just because of the battles that we're currently fighting, but I think the fact that you published this book does say a lot, that the story matters and that a huge publishing house wants the story to be told. That means something. Yeah. And so I hope that somebody picks up this book who's able to, judge a case or write a law or not shoot somebody, when they have a badge and a gun. Maybe you can change some hearts and minds as well, instead of, or even beyond just educating those of us whose history it is. So that's not a question. I'm just.
No, I think I love the, what are we gonna do? It's an important, I think, sometimes you're a writer at this event, somebody's like, what are you gonna do? My first remarks were defensive. I wrote the book, like that's what I did. But it's a legitimate question, and I think any work or any writer should have that question in their mind, you know what I mean? And I think one thing I think about now just from hearing you talk and sort of like where we are as a country it's really kind of a battle over the next generation. That's what this whole thing about anti-CRT is. It's about a world that you and I grew up in, which sort of said that America is going to continue to progress in a linear way. And that was just sort of what we were sort of taught in the 90s and 2000s. And that's been very wildly disrupted. And since probably since the election of Trump, but especially since 2020, very wildly disrupted. So young people are downloading a really different version of America. I have to give a shout out right now to my cousin Stanley. Stanley, can you stand up real quick? Be acknowledged. Stanley worked on this book with me as a research assistant. Stanley was a research assistant on this book. Hired him when he was 13 years old, actually. Wow. He was reading about the Red Summer. He read about World War I and black soldiers in that war, as well as World War II. He looked at the race massacre lawsuits that I referenced earlier. He went through all that stuff.
He's a smart young man.
Oh yeah, he's going to Princeton. No, Stanley's got it. Stanley's got it. I bring that up because I interviewed Stanley actually about 2 months ago. And first of all, it was kind of shocking because I was like, oh, you were grown, dude. Like, when did that happen? But what I realized is that, he had really downloaded almost a new worldview that I never had when I was 17. Like he saw the picture. He saw the big picture of what this country is, and beyond what sort of you get taught almost like propaganda when you're a kid. And so I just thought that was really powerful. But also the fact that, I think one red herring here is that, conservatives, some people that, this is going to make the kids really angry, or like it's going to make them like chaotic, anarchic in some sense. But talking to Stanley about it, he really explained to me how having that knowledge sort of strengthened his resolve to do more, armed with better weapons, to be honest with you. And also the fact that, again, we talked earlier about how my book isn't only about the traumas or the challenges, but also about the resilience. And so he told me he was actually very inspired by the story of Greenwood and the story of these people surviving that generation after generation. And so I think, it's just so much easier now for young people to access. They're trying to make it harder, but they're not going to be able to, the internet and everything. They can't stop it. They can't stop it. They can read your book, my book, if they want to. They can't stop us.
They can't. If they ban it, that makes it sell better.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I just think that I'm talking to Stanley actually gave me a little bit more hope because I can just see how he sees the picture in a way I couldn't when I was 17. And that's actually extremely radical in its own way.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about my students too, who are high school aged, they do see the world differently and they're not afraid of like shaking it up. It's not like, oh, what if we like mess up the world? They're like, yeah, like we need to mess up the world.
Exactly.
This world is not working at all.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, props to you, Stanley, my goodness. And congratulations on your acceptance to Princeton. And I'm sure you're gonna be just taking over the whole world soon. So, so I am gonna ask you, what are you gonna do? But more in terms of writing. Okay. So I'm not gonna do you like that at all. But I am curious if you have other projects in mind, or like, where does one go after writing this?
The beach.
Well, that's right. Going to the beach, yes. But literarily, where are we going next?
I don't quite know yet, but I do think that filling in this gap, Stanley also said this in our interview, but I think when you learn history in school, black people disappear between the end of the Civil War and Rosa Parks sat down on the bus.
Yep.
That's 100 years. We're just not in the picture.
Yep.
You learn all this stuff, Great Depression, Spanish-American War, Roaring Twenties, Tulsa Race Massacre happened in the Roaring Twenties. All this stuff, we're nowhere to be found.
Harlem Renaissance?
Yeah.
It's just one poet.
Right, exactly. Right.
Just one.
That's our one little sidebar. So I hope to write more books that fill in that gap. I feel like there's a 100-year gap in common American knowledge about the black experience. And I felt this book filled in one very important gap, but I felt there are many others, so I hope to write more books that fill in more of those gaps. That's my goal as a writer. I've been writing since I was 5 years old. This is really a shift in my journey, but it's always been my dream to sort of be in this moment. And so I'm excited to have it continue, from here. So.
Wow. Well, let's congratulate Victor again on the publication of this book. Okay, so at this point, I would love to open it up to the audience for questions. And I don't know how exactly we want to do that. Do y'all need a microphone, do you think? Because we can rig it up, I'm sure. I'll just make that choice. We're just gonna, I'll move this out, so if you want to come up and use the mic, you're welcome to. Or if you'd rather yell from the back, you're welcome to do that as well, if anybody has a question. Yes, sir.
Victor, as we talked about it, this story could have been told from dozens of cities where we had these atrocities. What drew you to Tulsa? Because the story resonates with me. We have people all over the country that went through a similar experience. What drew you to Tulsa?
Yeah, I mean, the real answer is it goes back more to the entrepreneurship, actually, than the atrocities part of it. I was living in Atlanta before this book, and I was having lunch with a high school friend in 2017, and he was talking about how he had never seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, didn't want to see it, because he was saying he was tired of seeing us being brutalized in all these depictions in pop culture. Being beaten as slaves, being whipped by the dog, bitten by the dog, the civil rights movement. And then I took to my friend, oh, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street? That's a story of us being successful. And so I felt like, again, that was that gap in the narrative, And so I think, really I was more attracted to the lens of the entrepreneurship and solidarity of your community. And so I think even that explains why the book is framed the way it is, built from the fire, all this kind of stuff. It kind of came from that side of it. And I knew I was going to have to sort of fill in all the horrible things that happened, but I wanted that community solidarity to really be the North Star.
Yes.
So reading the book, one of the really profound things is like your ability to communicate a place. I think being Southern, we're all about like where are you from, who are your relatives, and I've never been to Tulsa, so my understanding of Tulsa is largely through your words in our conversations. But what's the process maybe of like getting settled in a place that's not your own to tell such a deep story, and maybe talking a little bit about your experience as a person and a journalist coming into a new space to tell this really this really personal and deep story.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jake. It started with the Black Country playlist, like I said. So that was my first thing. Had the playlist going when I arrived in.
It's a Black country.
Black Country playlist. So Tina Turner has a country album called Tina Turner's The Country On.
Really?
It's amazing.
Okay.
It's not on Spotify. You gotta dig for it, but it's out there, okay? But I think what's interesting about that question is my whole plan got disrupted. I moved to Tulsa in November 2019. And my plan was, okay, I'm going to spend my whole first year like meeting people, going into their homes, having coffee with them, just meeting the 100 people in this community that I need to meet. Then COVID hits, right? And so that entire plan got disrupted in a lot of ways. And so what's kind of interesting about that is right before the pandemic, I started this email newsletter called Run It Back. And I sort of was like posting my research and my thoughts kind of in real time as I sort of worked my way through the book writing process. And what was really interesting about that is I slowly built up a big Tulsa audience. So on those sort of rare occasions when there'd be a public event, people would know me who I didn't know. Like I'd be going out to like Greenwood Avenue, yo, what's up, Victor? And they'd be like, whoa, we haven't even talked before. But then they were able to sort of get some sense of who I was from this newsletter that I was working on. So a lot of it ended up being kind of digital, to be honest with you. But then I also think what was really important, and my parents know this because everybody was saying this when my parents came to Tulsa for the book launch a month ago. And everybody we saw was saying like, oh yeah, we remember Victor, he was that little guy with the notebook everywhere. And so the fact that I was present, I was around, you know what I mean? People saw me taking notes at the city council meetings, at the protests, at all the events that matter to this community. I was always present. And I think just being present in a way that a journalist who comes for 4 or 5 days is not, kind of put me in a different light and category with the people that I was chronicling.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the ongoing efforts to dig Tulsa.
The mass graves. Sure. So after the race massacre, there's no agreement about how many people were killed during the race massacre. That's really important to understand. The official count by the city health department at the time was 36 people killed, which all experts agree is a massive undercount. Right now, the sort of agreed upon academic estimate is up to 300 people. So the question is, where are those people? And about 4 years ago, the city embarked on a search for mass graves in Tulsa. So they have several different sites that they've been exploring and excavating. So far, nothing concrete has been found, but I guess couple of months ago, the city announced that they had found some remains, which may or may not be race massacre victims, and they've made DNA matches with current living people. And so we don't know if these people that they've sort of dug up are race massacre victims, but right now they're actually trying to reach out to some of those descendants and try to get more of the historical context that might let them know that. So that's a really long, ongoing process. It's going to take years longer. I have kind of a complicated perspective on it because I think that work is really important and vital, and in some ways it kind of fulfills the moral side of the argument, I think, of like the moral thing we should do is find these people, give them their full histories, give them a burial. But the city's pursuing that really aggressively while they try to stymie this reparations lawsuit. And so I don't quite know exactly what their intentions or motives are as they sort of continue with this search. But it is definitely by far the most, to the city, it's the most important part of the remembering or reconciliation process. They put a ton of money into it. They're going to continue it. But as it stands today, there are remains that have been uncovered. We don't know if they're massacre victims, and we probably will find out more in the coming years.
And then you had a question right here.
Yeah, I want to know whose decision it was to name May 31st and June 1st Reconciliation Day, because it just seems like nothing was really reconciled. I do understand there were some wins, but it seems like there are so many more wins to be had. So I wonder who named that day Reconciliation Day.
Yeah, so I opened the modern section of the book, kind of going all in on the stuff we've been discussing. So the modern section of the book opens with a chapter called Reconciliation Day. And that time I first visited Tulsa in 2018 when the vigil was happening with the baseball game, it was the city who did it. So the mayor's office, I don't know if it was the mayor himself, but the mayor's office decided that was going to be called Reconciliation Day. And they had a ceremony with a proclamation saying, oh, this is Reconciliation Day. But to your point, no one's really reconciled in Tulsa over this event. So it rang very hollow to me. And, I have a sense of humor, as we've seen here. So I lay some irony throughout the book a little bit. And I think that was just me trying to, show through irony how absurd it was to even call that day that when you see what's going on in the community. But it was the mayor's office. I don't know the exact person.
Do we have any others? Yes.
Hi, Victor.
Hey.
I know you talked earlier about Montgomery and a little bit about, you talked before about your parents' experience growing up there and in the Deep South. Do you think being from Alabama specifically kind of set you up to be the perfect kind of storyteller for this story? Even though, like you said, controversial topic, it's not Deep Southern, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I do think it kind of goes back to that obligation, that's not the right word for it, but this sense that, this is in me somehow. And I kind of ran away from that for a while. Again, I have this old tech reporter background that we won't discuss.
You keep saying it.
But when I was actually doing that tech reporting stuff, it felt really hollow, I was a very successful reporter for Time Magazine and the Ringer, and I was making good money, and it was going to get to Silicon Valley and doing cool stuff, but it all felt very hollow to me. It didn't really feel like what I was supposed to be doing. And so I think when I sort of entered this project, things have been clicked into place, and I think that I also made me value my own family's history a lot more, I think, I think I'd always understood what my parents and grandparents and other people had experienced. I'd heard the stories, I guess. But I began to understand it in a better way and sort of see the full picture of it, even ask them more questions about what their experiences were. And so I think doing this has really made me value my Alabama heritage in a much more deep and intimate way. So I'm really glad I put down the iPhone and pursued this route instead.
Was that the job you left when you left and moved to?
Oh yeah, I was a tech blogger basically. Mm-hmm. So it was lame, honestly.
It's a part of your journey.
Yeah.
You had to do that to get to this.
Right, yeah. Exactly.
Change the language that you use with your tech reporting, It's
Yeah.
okay. You had to do it.
You're right. You're
Yeah.
right. Thank you for the pep talk.
Okay. Well, I want to give time. Oh, yes. Yes, sir.
Victor, you've been to lots of cities. Talk about this new book. Tell us what you've been most surprised at in the reaction to the book and all the places you've been so far.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Daniels. Dr. Daniels was my mentor at the University of Alabama, so I owe a lot to him too. Thank you, Dr. Daniels. It's been a lot. I think the diversity has been surprising to me. Every town has its own kind of vibe. Like when I was in Tulsa, that was like put up or shut up. Like you're in Greenwood and you wrote a book about these people, you better come correct. And it was really great. It was almost like a rally actually. Every time, every answer I gave there, they like cheered after every answer. So y'all need to step up. But I think why they were so excited was because no one had ever really put the pieces together in the way I did. Like I had an answer about redlining in Tulsa, for example. And I think hearing somebody explain, this is part of why your black community is the way it is, that was really powerful to them. And so it was really cool to sort of have that immediate reaction of people being like, oh, actually one guy who's like from North Tulsa, not from Greenwood. There's a dynamic also in Tulsa, and I think Birmingham must have this too, where there's like the historic important black part of town, and then there's like the regular black part of town. And so this guy's from North Tulsa, and he was saying, oh, like I read your book and I understand a little bit more about my community. And I thought that was cool because he wasn't like an activist or somebody really caught up in all that stuff, So that was really cool about the Tulsa event. I spoke at the Smithsonian, actually, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And again, it's kind of like put up or shut up. Like you're at the Smithsonian, you have to be able to hang with. I was actually with the former retired Smithsonian curator, so I really had to be able to hang, and I did. So that was really cool. And then what was really interesting, actually, I went to Seattle last week, and Seattle is, I think, in the contiguous United States as far as you can possibly get from Tulsa. And even there, I had like 30 or 35 people came. A couple of folks from Greenwood came. One of Greg's friends came. Thank you for that, Greg. And what was most interesting about that one, though, is that somebody actually who was the descendant of the white mob was there. So a woman whose grandfather had been part of the white mob was at that event. And so she came up to me afterwards, and she's told me that, she didn't know it, but she'd heard stories about how her grandfather was part of this, or pieced it together, what have you. And so she says she's going to have her whole family read this book. And so I thought that was interesting. I don't really know how I feel about that. Then there's other steps to be taken, Yeah. But, so I don't know. To me, that's not exactly heartwarming. It's kind of like, I don't know. I hope she takes more steps after she gets to download all the information. But that was surprising to meet somebody like that and to understand that this book is reaching some people. I've had several people email me, so I throw a lot of white folks under the bus in this book and in my newsletter. And some of their descendants have reached out to me, but it's always the folks who are kind of on the side of being thoughtful about why their ancestors behaved the way they did. I don't really hear from the people who are mad about it. So anyway, those are just some of the people I've met that's been interesting.
I feel like many of us who are authors could get together for like years and talk about what happens when people come up. No pressure to y'all who are going to come up in just a second. But it does. Sometimes there are those weird moments where someone's like kind of trying to apologize for all of history.
Right.
It's like I just don't know that that's what I'm asking you to do.
Right.
At all.
Right.
Because you can't. I mean, you can't. First of all.
Right.
But more so, what I'm always asking, and maybe you are too, is just for you to consider for yourself and figure out for yourself how you then can do something.
Yeah.
But there's no transaction that has to happen between you and me.
Right. I don't need to be on the other side of that story. Right. Like I met the black author and he was nice, so things are cool, So I don't know. Sorry. Anybody else?
Let's thank our authors for tonight.
I'm gonna get a photo of everybody before we stop for the gram. It's for the gram. I acknowledge that.